Why is it okay to provide armed security for yourself, but take away the rights of Americans?
Is ATF taking a legislative function and running with it?
But at the crux of this is a bureaucrat making a unilateral decision to try to turn millions of Americans into felons.
Partisans at the ATF have really run amok, infringing and trampling on the Second Amendment.
Getting assault weapons, AR-15s, out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
That men and women in this country have the right to defend their own lives.
Breaking news, Connecticut residents were taken aback when the Connecticut State Police introduced a new policy effectively prohibiting private transfers of firearms within the state. This policy change marks a significant departure from the previous practice and has generated considerable concern among both gun owners and Second Amendment advocates. Under this policy, all firearm sales, including private transactions between individuals, are now required to go through a licensed firearms dealer in Connecticut. This means that residents who were once able to engage in private transfers, often without the involvement of a licensed dealer, must now follow a more formal and regulated process. The immediate impact of this change is substantial. Previously, private firearm transactions could occur relatively informally, with individuals selling or transferring firearms among themselves without the need for background checks, paperwork, or fees. With the new policy, these transactions are subject to the same rigorous requirements as any other firearm sale, including background checks and proper documentation. This shift in policy has triggered concerns among gun owners and advocates in Connecticut and beyond. Many see it as a potential infringement on Second Amendment rights, as it limits the ability of law-abiding citizens to engage in legal private firearm transactions without government oversight. Proponents of the policy argue that it is a necessary step to enhance public safety. By ensuring that all firearm sales, regardless of whether they are private or commercial, go through an FFL and undergo background checks, they believe it can help prevent firearms from ending up in the wrong hands. However, opponents view the policy as governmental overreach into the private affairs of individuals. They argue that private transfers have long been a part of American firearm culture and that this change encroaches on individual liberties. In essence, the policy shift in Connecticut rekindles the ongoing debate about the balance between Second Amendment rights and public safety. While its immediate effects are felt by Connecticut gun owners, it serves as a focal point for advocates and opponents of gun control across the country, who are closely monitoring the situation to see if it sets a precedent for similar policies in other states. What you need to know: Connecticut has implemented a significant change in its firearms policy, fundamentally altering how firearm transactions occur within the state. Under this new policy, all firearm sales, whether involving handguns, rifles, or shotguns, must now be conducted exclusively through licensed firearm dealers in Connecticut. As a result, private sales of firearms between individuals, which were previously common, are now strictly prohibited.
Our Second Amendment. It's a hell no to government trampling on our freedoms.
That you said that all assault weapons should be banned. Is that a fair statement?
The primary requirement of this policy is that all firearm sales, regardless of their nature, must be facilitated through a licensed FFL. This means that even private transactions, such as selling a firearm to a friend or family member, must involve the services of an FFL. Consequently, individuals engaged in firearm transactions must navigate a more formalized and regulated process than what was customary in the past. One of the core implications of this policy is the discontinuation of private sales between individuals. This prohibition marks a significant departure from previous practices where individuals could engage in private transfers without involving an FFL. Under the new rules, all firearm sales, be they private or commercial, are subject to the same strict requirements. These requirements include conducting background checks on prospective buyers, as well as completing all necessary paperwork and documentation associated with the sale. This change has an immediate impact on firearm owners in Connecticut, particularly those who were accustomed to conducting private transactions. They must now adapt to a more structured process and bear the associated costs, such as fees for the services of FFLs. Advocates of this policy argue that it is a vital step towards enhancing public safety. They contend that by subjecting all firearm sales to comprehensive background checks and proper documentation, it can help prevent firearms from ending up in the wrong hands, potentially reducing the risk of gun-related incidents. Conversely, opponents see this policy as a potential infringement on Second Amendment rights. They believe it limits the ability of law-abiding citizens to engage in lawful private firearm transactions without government intervention. This change has reignited the ongoing debate about the balance between individual rights and public safety concerns in the context of firearms. Connecticut's shift from NICS to FFLs. Connecticut's transition from the NICS system to mandatory involvement of licensed firearms dealers in all firearms sales represents a significant change in the state's approach to background checks for private transfers. The shift is driven by the need to align with both state and federal requirements. Previously, Connecticut had been utilizing the NICS system for conducting background checks, even in private transfers of firearms. However, this practice was later deemed non-compliant with federal regulations. The federal government mandates that certain types of firearms transactions, including those involving private sales, must undergo background checks. Connecticut's use of the NICS system for these transactions did not meet these federal requirements, prompting the need for a policy change. The decision to involve FFLs in all firearm sales, whether private or commercial, is an effort to bring Connecticut's background check procedures in line with both state and federal regulations. By requiring all transactions to go through FFLs, the state aims to ensure that background checks are conducted uniformly and comprehensively, thereby meeting the obligations of both state and federal law.
But, Madam Speaker, guns have been prevalent in the United States of America since before our founding.
That men and women in this country have the right to defend their own lives.
This change has practical implications for firearm owners and buyers in Connecticut. Private transactions that were once subject to the NICS system now necessitate the involvement of an FFL, adding an extra layer of formality and regulation to the process. While this shift is driven by compliance with federal law, it has broader implications for how firearm sales and background checks are conducted within the state. Possible federal influence, ATF's role. The recent policy change in Connecticut that mandates all firearm sales go through licensed firearms dealers has raised suspicions among some observers regarding potential federal influence, particularly in the connection to the activities of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Some gun rights advocates and concerned individuals suspect that this policy shift may be influenced by federal regulations, and there is speculation about a possible connection to initiatives led by the ATF. The ATF has been actively involved in proposing changes to federal firearm regulations, including rules related to engaged in the business criteria for firearm sales. While the exact nature of the connection between the ATF and Connecticut's policy change remains speculative, it has led to increased scrutiny of federal involvement in state-level gun control policies. This suspicion has prompted gun rights advocates to closely monitor any potential federal influence on state-level firearm policies, including the changes in Connecticut. They are concerned that decisions at the federal level could have a ripple effect on state regulations, impacting the rights of gun owners and the broader landscape of firearm ownership in the U.S. As the debate surrounding gun control continues, the extent to which federal agencies like the ATF influence state-level policies remains a topic of interest and concern for those passionate about Second Amendment rights and the balance between federal and state regulations in the realm of firearms. Wider implications. Other states. This change in policy has raised concerns about its potential impact on other states and the broader landscape of gun ownership rights in the U.S. One major concern is that this policy change in Connecticut could set a precedent for other states to follow suit in restricting private transfers. States often look to one another for guidance on policy matters, and if Connecticut's approach gains traction, it could encourage other states to enact similar restrictions. This could result in a broader trend of tightening regulations around private firearm transactions, limiting the ability of individuals to engage in private sales without government oversight.
Getting assault weapons, AR-15s, out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
Guns don't kill people. People kill people. Criminals, miscreants will always get their hands on guns.
The potential ripple effect of this change on gun ownership rights is not limited to Connecticut alone. It has become a topic of national interest, drawing the attention of gun rights advocates and opponents across the country. Advocates for the Second Amendment are closely monitoring developments in Connecticut, as they fear that a successful implementation of such policies there may embolden other states to pursue similar measures. Conversely, proponents of stricter gun control measures see Connecticut's policy shift as a potential model for enhancing public safety. They argue that if successful in Connecticut, similar policies could be adopted by other states seeking to address perceived loopholes in the regulation of private firearm transactions. In essence, Connecticut's policy change serves as a test case with broader implications for the national debate on gun ownership rights and the balance between individual liberties and public safety. As states and policymakers across the country observe the outcome of this policy shift, it is possible that similar measures may be proposed or enacted in other states, further intensifying the ongoing debate surrounding firearms regulation in the U.S. Immediate impact. Connecticut gun owners have been directly affected by the recent policy change, and it has had immediate and tangible consequences for them. First and foremost, Connecticut residents who were accustomed to engaging in private transfers of firearms must now navigate the requirement to involve an FFL in all firearm sales. This means that even transactions between individuals, such as selling a firearm to a friend or family member, are subject to the same formalized and regulated process as commercial sales. This change represents a significant departure from the previous practice and requires gun owners to adapt to a more structured procedure. The practical implications of this policy change are evident. Gun owners now have to go through FFLs for all sales, which involves background checks, paperwork, and documentation. This can be a time-consuming process and may add complexity to what were once straightforward private transactions.
Second Amendment protects firearms in common use at the time and also said this, quote, for lawful purposes like self-defense.
Thousands of weapons that got stolen and then recirculated because there was no proof of them being sold anywhere.
Additionally, the involvement of FFLs often comes with associated fees, which individuals engaging in private sales may not have previously incurred. Financially, this change has implications for both buyers and sellers. The fees associated with using an FFL can increase the overall cost of the transaction. For sellers, this means potentially receiving less money for their firearms, as buyers may be less willing to absorb these additional costs. Conversely, buyers may face higher prices when purchasing firearms due to the added expenses associated with involving an FFL. CCDL's response. In response to the significant policy shift in Connecticut regarding firearm sales and the involvement of licensed firearms dealers, the Connecticut Citizens Defense League has taken a proactive stance to address the concerns of gun owners and advocate for their rights within the state. The CCDL, as a prominent organization dedicated to protecting and promoting the Second Amendment rights of Connecticut residents, has stepped up its efforts in the wake of this policy change. One of their primary initiatives is to actively gather information regarding the implications of the new policy. This includes collecting data on how the policy is affecting gun owners, the challenges they face, and any potential legal or regulatory issues that may arise. Furthermore, the CCDL is working diligently to respond to the concerns expressed by gun owners in the state. They are acting as a voice for those who feel their Second Amendment rights are being encroached upon by this policy shift. This includes engaging in public discussions, outreach, and advocacy efforts aimed at ensuring that the concerns of gun owners are heard and considered by policymakers. The organization's proactive approach is indicative of its commitment to preserving the rights of Connecticut residents in the realm of firearm ownership.
Under the new rule, these firearm owners will be required to obtain special registration.
Partisans at the ATF have really run amok, infringing and trampling on the Second Amendment.
They are closely monitoring the developments related to this policy change and are prepared to take further actions, such as legal challenges or advocacy campaigns, if deemed necessary to protect the interests of gun owners in the state. Federal versus state regulations. The recent policy change in Connecticut underscores the intricate relationship between federal and state regulations in the realm of firearms. This complex interplay has implications for the interpretation and application of the Second Amendment. At its core, this policy change brings to light the dynamic and sometimes challenging relationship between federal and state laws pertaining to firearms. The federal government establishes overarching regulations, while individual states have the authority to enact their own firearm policies. Connecticut's decision to impose stricter regulations on private transfers within its borders demonstrates how states can exercise their autonomy within the boundaries set by federal law. Legal experts and scholars are closely examining the constitutionality of such state-level changes, especially in the context of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment guarantees the right of American citizens to keep and bear arms. However, the interpretation and application of this amendment has been subject to considerable debate and legal scrutiny. In the case of Connecticut's policy change, questions arise about whether it infringes upon the Second Amendment rights of its residents. Advocates argue that it enhances public safety by regulating all firearm sales more uniformly, while opponents contend that it encroaches on individual liberties by limiting private transactions. This legal landscape highlights the ongoing tension between federal and state authorities in the regulation of firearms. While the federal government establishes certain baseline regulations, states have the authority to enact additional rules to address specific concerns within their borders. This leads to a patchwork of firearms laws across the country, making it essential for gun owners and legal experts to navigate a complex legal landscape. Public reaction. Connecticut residents have not remained silent in the face of the recent policy change regarding firearms sales and private transfers. They have actively voiced their concerns through multiple channels, including emails, text messages, and social media platforms. This vocal expression of concern has ignited a lively and passionate public discussion about gun ownership and regulation within the state. Emails and texts have been a direct and immediate means for Connecticut residents to communicate their apprehensions and objections to policymakers, advocacy groups, and government officials.
Well, Mr. Wilcox, there's no law. Congress didn't pass it. That's a rule from ATF.
Running for President of the United States wanted to strip away our enumerated constitutional rights.
These messages often outline specific concerns about how the policy change affects their rights, responsibilities, and access to firearms. The public reaction to this policy change has been marked by fervent advocacy for both proponents and opponents of stricter firearm regulations. While some support the policy as a step towards enhanced public safety, others view it as an infringement on Second Amendment rights. The discussions and debates on this issue have encompassed topics such as individual liberties, the role of government, and the balance between public safety and personal rights. Potential nationwide ramifications. The outcome of Connecticut's recent policy change regarding private firearm transfers has the potential to reverberate beyond the state's borders, influencing the direction of private transfers in other states across the nation. This policy shift in Connecticut serves as a litmus test for the broader landscape of private firearm transactions. Gun rights advocates and gun control proponents are closely monitoring the developments in Connecticut, recognizing that the outcome could set a precedent for similar policies in other states. If the policy change is deemed successful in enhancing public safety or addressing perceived regulatory gaps, it may encourage other states to adopt comparable measures. Conversely, if it faces significant challenges or pushback, it could discourage other states from pursuing such changes. The issue of private firearm transfers is central to the broader national debate over gun control. Advocates on both sides are actively engaged in shaping the direction of firearms regulations, including those related to private transactions. The Connecticut case serves as a focal point for their efforts, with each side seeking to advance its respective agenda. Staying informed. Gun owners in Connecticut who are affected by the recent policy change regarding firearm sales and private transfers are encouraged to stay informed and seek guidance from reliable sources. Staying informed is crucial to understanding the implications of the policy shift and how it may affect their rights and responsibilities. It's important to avoid relying on unverified or biased sources of information. Legal resources and organizations specializing in firearms law can be valuable sources of guidance. These organizations often provide resources and information related to firearms regulations in the state.
But at the crux of this is a bureaucrat making a unilateral decision to try to turn millions of Americans into felons.
This rule turns law-abiding gun owners into felons is a result of unelected bureaucrats.
Engaging with the local community and fellow gun owners can also be beneficial. Regularly checking for legal updates and changes to firearm regulations in Connecticut is essential. Staying informed about any amendments or revisions to the policy can help gun owners adapt to the evolving landscape of firearm ownership within the state. Advocacy and support. Advocacy groups dedicated to protecting Second Amendment rights have been actively mobilizing to support gun owners in Connecticut in response to the recent policy change. For individuals concerned about these changes and interested in defending their Second Amendment rights, joining or supporting these advocacy organizations can be a proactive step. These organizations actively engage with policymakers, legislators, and government officials to advocate for policies that protect and uphold Second Amendment rights. They work to influence legislation and regulations to align with the interests of gun owners. Legal support is another crucial aspect of their work. Advocacy groups may provide legal support and resources to individuals or cases related to Second Amendment rights. This can include legal representation, assistance with legal challenges, and resources to navigate firearm-related legal issues. Education and awareness initiatives are also common. Many advocacy groups focus on educating the public and gun owners about their rights and responsibilities. They provide information about firearm safety, regulations, and legal updates to ensure that individuals are well informed.
Is ATF taking a legislative function and running with it?
If there's a sickness in the country, it is the product of 60 years of disintegration of American culture.
Moreover, these organizations serve as platforms for community building. They bring together like-minded individuals, allowing them to connect, share information, and engage in discussions related to Second Amendment rights. This sense of community provides support and solidarity for gun owners facing policy changes and challenges to their rights. Federal-state relations. The relationship between federal and state governments in regulating firearms is a complex and contentious issue that has been a subject of ongoing debate in the U.S. The recent policy change in Connecticut, which mandates the involvement of licensed firearms dealers in all firearm sales, including private transfers, underscores the intricacies of this federal-state interplay. At its core, this policy change highlights the question of where the authority lies in regulating firearms. The federal government establishes overarching regulations, such as the National Firearms Act and background check requirements for licensed dealers. Connecticut's decision to impose stricter regulations on private transfers within its borders demonstrates how states can exercise their authority to address specific concerns and priorities. The balance of power between federal and state governments in firearm regulation is a central point of contention. Advocates of stricter federal regulations argue for a uniform approach to firearms, with federal laws setting a baseline that all states must follow.
They can take away your Second Amendment liberties, and then you have to petition for a subsequent hearing to get that right back.
Why is it okay to provide armed security for yourself, but take away the rights of Americans?
This complex interplay between federal and state regulations in the realm of firearms has far-reaching implications. It raises questions about how the appropriate balance of power between federal and state authorities and the extent to which individual liberties should be subject to uniform national standards. These debates are ongoing and will continue to shape the landscape of firearm regulation in the U.S. The debate over private transfers. The policy shift in Connecticut regarding private firearm transfers has reignited a long-standing and passionate debate that extends far beyond the state's borders. This debate represents a clash of perspectives and values, with advocates on both sides passionately defending their positions. They argue that private firearm transfers are a fundamental aspect of exercising one's Second Amendment rights, and that regulations that restrict private transactions infringe upon those rights. Second Amendment advocates often argue that the right to keep and bear arms is a cornerstone of American freedom and should not be unduly restricted by government regulations. This debate encapsulates broader discussions about the balance between public safety and individual liberties. Gun control proponents seek to enhance public safety by tightening regulations, while Second Amendment advocates are concerned about potential government overreach and the erosion of individual freedoms. The clash of these perspectives underscores the complex and deeply rooted nature of the debate over firearm regulations in the U.S. Gun owners' responsibilities. As firearm laws evolve and change, it is paramount for gun owners to take responsibility for staying informed about their rights and responsibilities. Gun owners should actively educate themselves about the legal framework governing firearms, both at the federal and state levels. Accessing official government resources and seeking guidance from legal experts or advocacy organizations can be valuable in this regard. Compliance with firearm laws is not only a legal obligation, but also a moral and ethical responsibility. Responsible gun ownership entails adhering to the law to ensure the safety of oneself and the community. This involves conducting background checks when required, following storage and safety guidelines, and participating in any mandatory training or licensing processes as stipulated by law. Additionally, Ongoing vigilance is crucial as laws and regulations can change over time. Staying updated on legal developments and amendments to firearm laws is essential to remain in compliance. Being proactive in seeking legal advice and staying connected with advocacy organizations can help gun owners navigate these changes effectively. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.